The rain hammered against the windows of the modest apartment I now called home, each drop echoing the hollow ache in my chest. 6 months had passed since I buried my son Michael, and 3 months since his wife Sarah had coldly informed me that I was no longer welcome in the house I had helped them buy, the house where I had lived for the past 2 years after my husband's death. "It's time you found your own place, Eleanor," she had said, her voice devoid of the warmth that once made me believe she truly loved my son. "I need space to grieve, and frankly, your presence here is difficult." Difficult. That single word had cut deeper than any blade. I was difficult. The mother who had raised Michael single-handedly after his father died when he was 12, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who had welcomed Sarah into our family with open arms when Michael brought her home 5 years ago. I stared at the eviction notice I'd found taped to my door that terrible day in March. Sarah hadn't even had the courtesy to serve it herself. She'd hired a lawyer, citing irreconcilable differences, and claiming that my continued presence in her home was causing her emotional distress during her grieving process. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she spoke of grieving, I had watched through the window of my son's house, our house, as she entertained male visitors barely 2 weeks after the funeral. Young men who stayed late into the night, their laughter drifting across the yard like a mockery of the silence that should have honored Michael's memory. But what broke my heart most wasn't her callous treatment of me. It was the way she had systematically erased Michael from his own home. Within a month of his death, his photos had disappeared from the mantelpiece. His books, carefully collected over years, had been boxed and stored in the garage. Even his garden, the vegetable patch he'd tended with such pride, had been torn up and replaced with ornamental flowers. Michael would have wanted me to move on, she'd told me when I'd confronted her about the changes. He wouldn't want me to live in a shrine. Move on. As if 28 years of my son's life could be packed away like seasonal decorations. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and picked up the letter that had arrived that morning. The law office of Hendricks and Associates requested my presence for the reading of Michael's will. I had assumed there was little to discuss. Michael had always been careful with money, but he was young, and most couples his age didn't think much about wills and estates. How wrong I was. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown building that had seen better days. The waiting room smelled of old leather and disappointment, and the receptionist, a thin woman with kind eyes, offered me coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since morning. "Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Hendricks will see you now." I followed her down a narrow hallway lined with legal certificates and photographs of the firm's founding partners. Mr. Hendricks rose from behind his desk as I entered, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the weary expression of someone who had delivered too much bad news over the years. "Mrs. Whitman, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." He gestured to one of 2 leather chairs facing his desk. "I should mention that Mrs. Sarah Whitman will be joining us shortly." As if summoned by his words, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She had changed since I'd last seen her at the funeral. Her dark hair, once long and carefully styled, now fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a black dress that managed to be both mourning-appropriate and subtly seductive, and her makeup was flawless, despite the tears she claimed to shed nightly. "Eleanor," she said, offering me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How unexpected to see you here." Unexpected? I kept my voice level, though my hands trembled slightly. Michael was my son. Yes, well... Sarah settled into the chair beside me, careful not to let our arms touch. "I suppose there might be some small bequest." Michael was always sentimental about family. Mr. Hendricks cleared his throat and opened a thick manila folder. Ladies, we're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Michael James Whitman, dated 18 months ago and properly witnessed according to state law. 18 months ago. That would have been just after Michael's promotion to senior architect at the firm, just after he'd started talking about wanting children, about building something lasting. The will is quite detailed, Mr. Hendricks continued, so I'll summarize the major provisions first, then read the specific language for anything requiring clarification. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her fingers drumming against her purse. I noticed her wedding ring was gone, replaced by a thin gold band on her right hand. First, regarding the house at 1247 Maple Street, purchased jointly by Mr. and Mrs. Whitman in 2019. Mr. Hendricks paused, looking over his glasses at both of us. Mr. Whitman has left his 50% ownership interest to his mother, Eleanor Whitman. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's drumming fingers stopped abruptly. "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah's voice was sharp. That can't be right. The house is mine. We bought it together. We're married." "Indeed you are," Mr. Hendricks said calmly. "However, the deed shows that Mr. Whitman purchased his share with funds from an inheritance he received from his grandfather, funds that, according to state law, remained his separate property even after marriage. He was free to dispose of that interest as he saw fit." I felt something cold and bright bloom in my chest. Michael, my careful, thoughtful son, had protected me even in death. But surely... Sarah turned to me, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. "Eleanor, you understand that the mortgage payments, the upkeep? I can't afford to maintain the house if I have to buy out your share." Mr. Hendricks consulted his papers again. "That brings us to the second major provision. Mr. Whitman has left his entire investment portfolio to his mother, stocks, bonds, and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $340,000. Sarah went very still. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. "Additionally," Mr. Hendricks continued, "there's a life insurance policy through his employer with Mrs. Eleanor Whitman listed as the primary beneficiary. The payout is $500,000. "What?" Sarah shot to her feet. "That's impossible. I'm his wife. I should be the beneficiary." "Mr. Whitman changed the beneficiary approximately 2 years ago, shortly after his mother moved in with you. The change was properly documented and witnessed." Mr. Hendricks's voice remained professionally neutral. "The insurance company has confirmed the paperwork is in order." Sarah sank back into her chair, her face pale. 2 years ago," she whispered. "But why would he—" I knew why. 2 years ago was when Sarah had first started working late, when her phone started buzzing with messages she wouldn't explain, when she began treating Michael's mother, me, like an unwelcome burden rather than family. Michael had been a quiet observer, but he wasn't blind. "There's more," Mr. Hendricks said. "Mr. Whitman has left detailed instructions regarding his personal effects. All photographs, books, personal papers, and mementos are to be given to his mother. Additionally, ... He paused, consulting another page. "He specifically requests that his vegetable garden be maintained as he left it, and that his mother be given full access to tend it if she so chooses." Tears stung my eyes. Even in death, my son was protecting the things he knew mattered to me. Sarah was staring at the floor, her hands clenched in her lap. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Michael loved me. We were happy. Why would he do this?" "Perhaps," I said, finding my voice at last, "because he knew you better than you thought he did." She looked up at me sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" I thought of all the things I could say, about the men I'd seen coming and going, about the way she'd spoken to Michael in those final months, with barely concealed irritation when he wanted to spend quiet evenings at home instead of going out to bars and clubs, about how she'd flirted shamelessly with his friends at the funeral, accepting their condolences with a smile that was far too bright. Instead, I simply said, Michael was observant. He noticed things. "There's one final provision," Mr. Hendricks interjected diplomatically. "Mr. Whitman has left a sealed letter for his wife, Mrs. Sarah Whitman. He asked that this be delivered to you today." He handed her a cream-colored envelope with her name written in Michael's careful handwriting. Sarah stared at it as if it might bite her. "Aren't you going to open it?" I asked. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. As she read, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and finally, something that looked like shame. "What does it say?" I asked gently. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. He says he knew about Derek and Ryan. He says he forgave me, but he couldn't trust me anymore. He says he hoped that someday I'd understand the difference between love and infatuation, between commitment and convenience." She looked up at me, tears finally falling. "He says he's sorry he couldn't be the man I needed him to be, but he's glad he could be the son you deserved." The silence in the room was profound. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its business, while our small drama played out in this leather-scented office. "Mrs. Whitman, Eleanor," Mr. Hendricks said finally, "there are some papers you'll need to sign to formalize the transfer of assets. The life insurance payout should be processed within the week. As for the house, you and Mrs. Sarah Whitman will need to decide how to proceed with the joint ownership." I looked at Sarah, this woman who had been my daughter-in-law, who had shared my son's bed and dreams and final years. She looked younger somehow, deflated, like a balloon with the air slowly leaking out. "Sarah," I said quietly, "what will you do?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her careful makeup. "I don't know. I can't afford the house payments on my own, and if you own half?" She trailed off. "I could buy you out," I offered. "The life insurance money would cover it." She looked at me suspiciously. "Why would you do that? After what I did?" I thought about it for a long moment. Why would I help the woman who had thrown me out of my son's house, who had betrayed him, who had tried to erase his memory? "Because," I said finally, "Michael loved you once. Maybe not at the end, but he did love you. And because you're young, and people sometimes make terrible mistakes when they're young and scared and don't know what they really want." Sarah stared at me, new tears forming. "You're being kind to me." "Why?" "Because holding on to anger would dishonor Michael's memory. He was a good man, Sarah. He deserved better from both of us." Mr. Hendricks was shuffling papers, trying to give us privacy for this unexpected moment of honesty. "What do you mean, both of us?" Sarah asked. I sighed. "I mean, I should have seen what was happening. I should have talked to him, tried to help somehow. Instead, I just watched my son grow quieter and sadder, and I told myself it was work stress or wedding planning or just the natural settling that happens in marriages." "You couldn't have changed anything," Sarah said softly. I was selfish. Michael was steady and reliable and safe, but I wanted excitement. I wanted to feel young and desirable. I thought I could have both." She laughed bitterly. "I thought he'd never find out. I thought I could keep my safe life with him and still have my adventures on the side. And now? Now I've lost everything. The man who loved me, the home we built, the future we planned. And I've hurt the one person who might have helped me through this grief, his mother." I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, fragile as bird bones. "It's not too late to do right by his memory," I said. We can't change what happened, but we can choose how we go forward. Sarah squeezed my hand, and for a moment I saw the young woman Michael had fallen in love with 5 years ago. Vulnerable, lost, but not entirely beyond redemption. "I'd like that," she whispered. "If you'll let me, I'd like to try to make things right." 6 months later, I stood in Michael's garden, my hands dirty with soil, carefully transplanting the tomato seedlings I'd started in my kitchen window. The house was mine now. Sarah had accepted my buyout offer and moved across town to a small apartment near her job. But she visited sometimes, usually on Sundays, usually bringing flowers for Michael's grave and vegetables for the soup we'd learned to make together from his recipe cards. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Some betrayals are too deep for that. But it was something else, an understanding, perhaps, that grief shared is grief lessened, and that honoring someone's memory requires more grace than vengeance. The will reading had given me justice, but not the kind I'd expected, not the dramatic confrontation and public humiliation I'd sometimes fantasized about during those long, lonely months in my cramped apartment. Instead, it had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that my son had seen me, had valued me, had wanted to protect me even as his own world fell apart. Sarah appeared at the garden gate, as she often did on these Sunday afternoons, carrying a small bouquet of daisies from the flower shop downtown. "How are the tomatoes coming along?" she asked, setting the flowers on the garden bench Michael had built. "They'll be ready in a few weeks," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. Michael always said the secret was in the soil preparation. "He was proud of this garden," Sarah said quietly. "I was wrong to tear it up. I was wrong about a lot of things." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, she pulling weeds from between the pepper plants while I finished with the tomatoes. This had become our ritual, tending Michael's garden together, sharing stories about him, slowly rebuilding something that wasn't quite family, but wasn't quite friendship either. "Eleanor," Sarah said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think he knew, really knew, that he was going to die so young?" I considered the question carefully. Michael had died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning, struck by a drunk driver who walked away without a scratch. There had been no warning, no time to prepare. "No," I said finally. "I don't think he knew when he'd die, but I think he knew something about life that maybe we're just learning now." "What's that?" "That love isn't just about how you feel in the good times. It's about what you choose to do when things get difficult, when you're tempted to take the easy path instead of the right one, when you have to decide whether to protect someone or protect yourself." Sarah was quiet for a long time, her hands still among the weeds. "I chose wrong," she said finally. "We both did, in our own ways. But maybe that's not the end of the story." As the sun began to set behind the maple trees Michael had planted along the back fence, I looked at the thriving garden, at the woman who had once been my enemy working beside me, at the house that now held space for both grief and forgiveness. Michael's will had given me material justice, money, property, security. But the real inheritance, I was beginning to understand, was the example he'd set: how to love imperfect people, how to forgive without forgetting, how to choose grace over vengeance even when it would be easier to choose otherwise. The rain began again as we gathered our tools, the same gentle spring rain that had fallen the day of Michael's funeral. But this time, it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like growth, like new beginnings, like the promise that even the deepest wounds could someday heal into wisdom. At the will reading, I had expected to find justice. Instead, I found something far more valuable: the chance to honor my son's memory by becoming the person he had always believed I could be. Sometimes the greatest revenge against betrayal isn't punishment, but the choice to respond with such grace that it transforms everyone involved. As we walked toward the house together, Sarah carrying the flowers and me carrying the memory of my son's love, I realized that Michael's final gift hadn't been the money or the property. It had been the opportunity to discover that some victories are won not by defeating our enemies, but by refusing to let them turn us into people our loved ones wouldn't recognize. The will reading had indeed delivered justice, just not the kind I'd expected, and infinitely more healing than what I'd thought I wanted.